All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. Um, we last left off talking about the progressive era, talking about the uh, the progress, the progression from uh, democratic opposition and the populist party and all that, all the way to Taft and the 1912 election that kind of blew the Republicans apart. Today we'll be talking about who the Democrat who arose in because of that split. But before we get started, I want to remind you guys that in 2 weeks we will be having the midterm, and along with that midterm will be the reading. Your guys' reading journals will be due. So, um, I want to remind you guys that you're supposed to be writing 100 words per week on each week's readings. That doesn't mean 100 words per each reading. That's just 100 words per a week. And that can be about anything you want. Just basically, it needs to prove that you are reading it and thinking about it. So summarization is not does not qualify as um showing your work. Part of that 100 words. You will not get a good grade if you're just summarizing that week's readings. Um, so, with that being said, there's also going to be the midterm, which will be which will be 5 questions, 5 identity questions. The week prior, you will get I think it might already be up, but there will be uh, a study guide so that you will know the possible key terms that you will need to be able to identify, including identifying the significance of each thing. Without that significance, you will not get a good grade. Um, Finally, there is a quiz going on Learn right now, um, that should take no longer than 10 minutes if you have been following class. Um, and yeah, it will be up until the end of business on Friday, meaning midnight, Friday night. It will be available basically all of today and tomorrow. Um, so, with all of that being said, before we launch into the lecture, any questions? Mm-hmm.
I had a question about the journal readings. If you wanted them in any type of certain font, double spaced, or anything like that.
No, I don't really care. However you'd like. Just make sure if you are quoting something that you need to cite that. Um, you know, always cite what you are quoting. Okay, so that being said, any other questions? Yeah, let's launch into the lecture. Hold on a second while I hit the screen share. So, we've been talking about the progressive era this week. This is kind of the end of the progressive era. Woodrow Wilson is the president who arose because of the split in the Republican Party. It was pretty obvious from the electoral map that that I showed last session that if it weren't for that split in the party, the Democrats would not have won the election. That Woodrow Wilson only came to power with 42% of the vote. But the he did campaign as kind of a progressive himself, and that's because of his background. Wilson was, if it'll switch the things, there we go. Wilson was an academic. he was a prominent academic at that. But his origins kind of show why he was a Democrat and why this was such a weird outcome for progressivism. Um, so he was born in 1855 or 54. I might be getting that wrong. Um, but he was born in the 1850s in the South. His father was a preacher for the Presbyterian Church and actually a pretty prominent member, because when the Presbyterians split up, he became the secretary of the Southern Presbyterian Church. Now, the Presbyterian Church split up over the issue of slavery, whether or not it was theologically sound to have slave masters being in the congregation. Of course, the Southerners, the Southern Presbyterians, sided with slavery was theologically okay, whereas Northerners opposed this. Um, but his father was also quite an American exceptionalist. He taught his son about the whole idea of the shining city on a hill, as in the America was destined to be the exemplar of liberty and justice for all. But of course, the South seceded, claiming that they needed to protect that very thing that the Southern Presbyterians had already split up over, slavery. But of course, Wilson was a young guy when the Civil War happened. He remembered his father's church, for instance, being used as a hospital during the Civil War. So he had that Southern upbringing, but only remembered it as a little kid. But once he became old enough to go to college, he ended up going to a bunch of Northern colleges in a pretty, well, as the slide says, scattershot manner. That he ended up going to 5 different colleges before he got his PhD. And at one point, he actually tried to become a lawyer. But something that would plague him for his entire life is that he would have what he originally called bouts of lost memory, but what were actually strokes. He would have strokes throughout his entire life on a fairly regular basis, and he actually lost his law practice because of that. But he said that it was because of lost memory. But in 1885, he got his PhD in political science. The actual history profession was a fairly new thing at this point. The first PhD in history had been given by Yale in 1882. So a lot of people would get PhDs in something else and then become a historian from that, and a lot of them were poli-sci majors. Wilson being one such person, and he wrote his dissertation was called Congressional Government, which basically postulated that the president of the United States was the presidency itself was too weak, and that that Congress held all the power. He was also fairly opposed to this. He thought that that essentially a good orator should be, the person who can convince the people should be given more power than Congress. He wasn't exactly wrong in that Congress had more power, especially as we'll see in just a little bit. This was playing into his belief that Congress had become too radical in the 1870s during Reconstruction. And so remember the Reconstruction lecture where Congress basically overruled the president to put on their own form of Reconstruction. Um, Wilson was pretty angry about this. He also thought that the British were particularly good, was a particularly good system of government, especially the way that a good orator could rise up in the party and become prime minister. Um, so you can already see that Wilson has a bent against um, against racial justice. He has a bent against um, any kind of congressional oversight. He has a bent against basically the American form of government. Um, and he has this strange kind of American exceptionalism built into it. Wilson was anything if not a bundle of contradictions. Um, but he was, you know, now a PhD, and he went into teaching. He eventually wrote a series of books known as that. Well, it actually went by 3 different names, because at this point people would publish multi-volume sets and then change the name of the set like halfway through. It was pretty common. But also Wilson would make fun of the fact that he like refused to use as many footnotes as possible. So um he was much more about trying to push his idea of history than trying to cite where he's getting his information from, which led him to write this series of books that is generally called The History of the American People, sometimes called The People's History of America. But that name has been supplanted by more recent historians. But the main thing that this thing did was push the lost cause. Um, and we've talked a lot about the lost cause, but I want to go a little bit deeper into it here. We'll get back to this frame in just a second, but let's go into what the lost cause was and why this was such a big deal that Wilson was pushing it. So the general idea of the lost cause is that one, slavery was good for the slave, that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, that it was purely a war of northern aggression, and that Reconstruction was designed specifically to punish the South for their rebellion. Obviously, all of these things are false, very clearly, but at the time of Wilson's upbringing, this was starting to gain traction, especially throughout the 1880s and 1890s. This became part of the myth that underlay Jim Crow. Remember the Jim Crow lecture and how much the lost cause played into that. And you can see how these specific tenets attempt to erase the racial bigotry of the South. They try to basically lionize the Confederacy. So when you see, for instance, there were a bunch of Confederate statues being raised throughout the 1890s and early 20th century as part of that Jim Crow. In fact, you guys might remember that Mississippi just changed their flag so that it no longer has the Confederate Jack on it. That was implemented in 1890 as a very obvious homage to the fact that they were leaders in the movement to create Jim Crow. So all of this stuff is trying to lionize the South. You know, they're raising statues, all that kind of stuff. But not just the South, that specific 4 or 5 years of Southern history. And trying to basically deny everything that it actually stood for. But that's kind of how memory works. People often try to always are the heroes of their own stories, right? And Wilson, growing up in all of this, clearly was influenced by it, and he took a lot of these lost cause principles and implemented it in his history of the American people. Um, so it didn't actually start off as clearly racist. It started off as just trying to kind of bring the nation back together and say, like, no, we weren't fighting about bad things. We were fighting for liberty and justice, and it just didn't work out. Um, so the so that narrative started off very much as a grassroots movement, but it started to gain traction, especially as Jim Crow came to be implemented. Remember, we've talked about Jim Crow, that it didn't just get implemented by the steady movement to segregate or anything. It got implemented through racial terror, through white supremacist terrorists um, making sure to try to disenfranchise Black people. And eventually, with enough disenfranchisement, um, by de facto disenfranchisement, as in, the terrorism stopping Black people from voting, um, laws were made by the newly elected white supremacists to continue that disenfranchisement by law, by implementing poll taxes and all that kind of stuff. You guys will remember this from the Jim Crow lecture. So with all that came a more colloquial belief in the lost cause, because it helped underlie Jim Crow. But academia did not sit still with this. There was a series of people who believed in what's known as the Dunning School of Reconstruction. And the Dunning School, throughout the late 1880s and early 1890s, tried to basically say that Reconstruction was punitive, that it was designed to punish the South. And they used quotes from various, we talked in the Reconstruction lecture about people waving the bloody flag, the bloody shirt and all that. They used those kinds of quotes to illustrate a much more negative picture of this. Of course, it explicitly denies civil rights. All that civil rights legislation we talked about with Reconstruction, Dunning School basically said, well, that was so that they could unleash the carnal nature of Black people. That Black people had some sort of innate characteristic that they wanted to rape white women and destroy white civilization. This was inherently white supremacist. But Wilson fell under the Dunning School as he was writing all of this. And so once he wrote his History of the American People, which became quite a bestseller at the time, he essentially legitimized the lost cause. Wilson is the key figure for why the lost cause became accepted, even though you can see how it's all basically just mythology and building up a myth through falsification. The general public doesn't really care about what's correct or incorrect. They just want a good story, even when that good story happens to legitimize the disenfranchisement of Black people. And Wilson was very much a part of all of this with his History of the American People. Now, there had also been a trend at this point by historians like Frederick Jackson Turner. You guys read his, a cut down version of his frontier thesis in a couple of weeks ago. And also Teddy Roosevelt, who was also a historian, had attempted to minimize the role of slavery in American history. They talked a lot about westward expansion, and slavery was something that westward expansion kind of fought against. So the Turner, for instance, described the slavery issue of the sectional crisis, which preceded the Civil War, as a temporary aberration. And Roosevelt basically didn't talk about slavery whatsoever in his Winning of the West series. So you have them supporting the Lost Cause kind of tangentially, but at the same time, they directly opposed Wilson's book by writing kind of scathing reviews of it, saying that like you can't just say that the KKK was trying to assert legitimate government. They were vigilantes and terrorists at that. So you can see Turner and Roosevelt aren't exactly fans of the Lost Cause, but they had played into it. Despite that kind of support for the Lost Cause and that, Woodrow Wilson became quite popular and eventually ascended to the presidency of Princeton University in 1902. The Board of Regents, which happened to include a former president, Grover Cleveland. Something you have to understand about Princeton is, even though it's in New Jersey, it's kind of seen as the southern university, since all the other ones are up in New England. New Jersey is what's called a central colony. But Cleveland was a Democrat, and of course the Democrats are very much the party of the South at this point. And Cleveland initially supported Wilson, but as he started to really, for instance, he expelled a lot of black people from Princeton during his time there, and also he started trying to go after what were known as eating clubs, and essentially this was a thing where elite students could pay for good lunches, essentially. He also created a program that's actually still part of Princeton today, which is that teachers basically become mentors for students, and this was extremely expensive for the university and almost bankrupted her. And so Cleveland steadily turned against Wilson throughout this. And in 1910, Wilson decided to run for the governorship of New Jersey. And Cleveland conspired to have him kicked out as president during the campaign, because Wilson wasn't actually working as the president of the university anymore, since he was campaigning and all that. That was Cleveland's excuse, but obviously Cleveland had ulterior motives. But Wilson used that to actually gain support from the press. He went to the press and basically tattled on Cleveland. And Cleveland had become fairly unpopular by this point. And I believe he actually died in 1909, something like that. But his Cleveland's proteges and all that kind of stuff were portrayed as conspiring to eliminate the good professor. Of course, as we've seen, Wilson was quite the opposite of such a depiction, but the press ate it up, and they very much supported him for the governorship, in which he got. He got elected in 1910, took it in 1911, and continued all the way until he became president. Now, he ran for president during 1912, saying that there would be basically proposing his own form of the square deal. You will remember from last session, that whole square deal thing. Saying that there would be new freedoms for those who elected him. But he was actually quite a bit more conservative. After all, he was a Southern Democrat, the first to be elected in decades, um, in the better part of a century, actually. Um, but the Republican split meant that he got elected anyways, which led to him being able to enact his policies. So the first thing on the chopping block was tariffs, always a thing that Democrats opposed from their earliest days. They actually came to power under the Jackson administration because of opposition to a tariff. And now that there was the passage of the 16th Amendment, which allowed for the collection of income taxes, Wilson created the Internal Revenue Service, which we still have today. The IRS is the one in charge of collecting income tax, and this allowed him to lower the tariff, since there was no longer the tax need for the tariff. This was generally considered a fairly progressive policy. Republicans still wanted higher tax revenues, and many of them supported keeping the tariff high, even with the IRS. But Democrats opposed tariffs pretty much always. But he also created the Federal Trade Commission. The FTC is yet again another thing that we still have. And essentially, it allows trust, instead of just trust busting, it allows for more discrete implementation of business laws. So he passed a bunch of business reform laws that essentially the FTC could regulate how business is done, especially in mind of preventing monopolies from forming, since trust busting could only bust monopolies once they had already formed. The FTC was fundamentally weakened by corruption within its ranks, but there's kind of a question of how much Wilson had anything to do with that, and how much of that was just the inherent corruption that will sneak into the creation of new powerful arms of the government. He also sponsored the creation of the Federal Reserve System. The Fed, as it's normally called, essentially replaced how before this, all banks were required to have a certain a reserve banking system, meaning that they had to have a certain amount of money on hand at all times. And that was essentially owned by the federal government. This Federal Reserve System that predated it was completely decentralized. There wasn't a central bank. What the Fed is essentially a bank where everyone has to every major bank has to have a membership in. The board that runs the Fed is made up of bankers throughout the U.S. Who are voting members of the Fed. It basically replaced that decentralized system and made it centralized. It's a pretty basic reform, but the one of its kind of superpowers is that it can regulate what interest rates are throughout the country. And so it can raise and lower interest rates. It can also do what's called fractional reserve, where it basically prints money on loan. And then that money gets paid back. We just saw a huge amount of that last year with a bunch of fractional reserve loaning. That's why you might remember from early last year, people were talking about like the government just created $2 trillion. They didn't just create it. They essentially loaned it out. And once it gets paid back, ceases to exist. So they didn't create it. It just is. It's a weird banking thing, but this was essentially meant to prevent any kind of depressions. Um, as we will find out later on in class, this did not work. In fact, uh, the Fed's inability to regulate interest rates correctly might have led to the worst depression in American history. Um, but the idea is that it was to stop um, depressions. Even during there was a depression during Wilson's presidency in 1920, so it didn't even work during his own presidency. But um, the weird and wonky ways that the Fed works inspires a lot of people to conspiracy theorize about this, but understand that this was basically just centralizing a system that already existed, and giving that power of regulating interest rates. Um, we could debate about like how well it's functioned, but that's all it really is. But also the real defining thing of Wilson's presidency wasn't these kind of minor reforms. He also implemented Jim Crow in the federal government. So what he did was kind of underhanded. He appointed a bunch of white supremacists as his um, cabinet. There we go. As his cabinet, and the one of them being William Jennings Bryan. You might remember him, but he actually ended up quitting as all this stuff started happening, and these cabinet officers started to segregate federal jobs. Up until this point, the federal government was actually kind of a safe haven for Black people to find work. They would very easily find work in the post office or as marshals. So you could actually expect to find equal employment in the federal government even while Jim Crow was being implemented. But Jim Crow came to the federal government in 1913. And this steadily happened, and Wilson constantly portrayed himself as not knowing what his officers were doing, despite the fact that he had appointed them and he had the full right to overrule what they were saying. But when civil rights officials such as the NAACP came to actually meet with him, he would repeatedly say that this was for their own good, that essentially segregating people would allow them to not fight with each other, and therefore it's good for them. Of course, it didn't say that he was relegating Black people to far worse posts than what they were previously allowed to work. But Wilson, as I have already said, is anything if not a bundle of contradictions. He also, you'll remember from the Jim Crow lecture that there was The Birth of a Nation that came out in 1915, which was so popular that it fostered the creation of the second Ku Klux Klan, as kind of a fraternal organization, which very quickly turned towards terrorism. But Wilson filmed this, and this was literally the first film to ever be filmed in the White House. Displayed it in the White House, and supposedly endorsed it. There's actually some debate as to whether or not he did, but given his character, I don't doubt that whatsoever. In either case, he played it at the White House, and this became the foundation of the second Ku Klux Klan. It is still a favorite film of Klansmen today. And with this rise of the Klan, he very much chose to ignore all the lynching that started to spike during his presidency, especially in 1919 during what is called Red Summer. There would be a series of race riots and lynchings throughout the United States, and Wilson did nothing about it. Um, he would actually do nothing about the Spanish flu during his presidency as well, but that was more because of war considerations. But given our recent debacle with disease, it's kind of notable. Um, and he would, in fact, end up dedicating a number um, of statues throughout his presidency, including a memorial to Confederate dead in Arlington Cemetery, the national cemetery um, for U.S. veterans. Obviously, Confederate veterans are not U.S. veterans, but they would, in fact, have a number of Confederate veterans interred in Arlington Cemetery because of his administration, and they still remain there today. So there are Confederates in Arlington Cemetery. Um, he also um, during the and we'll talk about World War One next week. But during World War One, he sponsored the independence of the Philippines and creating American citizens out of Puerto Ricans. This was essentially so that he could stop their independence movements, kind of. Wilson was actually very much in favor of the Philippine insurrection. Even when it turned towards genocide, he never spoke out against the genocide, even though he was president of Princeton and had spoken very much in favor of it. He never turned against it like Roosevelt did. And so this kind of opposition to Philippines and Puerto Rican independence was much more about his idea of the white man's burden. Essentially, he opposed their independence because he didn't think they were capable of self-determination, something that we will talk a lot about in the World War I lecture. But he would often talk about how nations needed to self-determine, but he would oppose any kind of place that was known for being people of color, because their self-determination they were not capable of self-determination, apparently. Needed the US government to be a father to them. And also he opposed women's suffrage all the way until 1919. Which became quite a problem throughout his presidency. So let's talk about women's suffrage and the entire movement towards that, and that weird change that happened in 1919. So the women's suffrage movement had been going strong since the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, where a bunch of basically New Englanders met in Seneca Falls, New York, to declare that, or to quote the actual Declaration of Sentiments, they said, "When a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of the women under this government, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to demand the equal station to which they are entitled." So pretty strong words there, evoking the Declaration of Independence, and saying women should be allowed to vote. So this sparked off a series of yearly conventions that took place from beginning in 1849 and continuing well into the 20th century. that um, women would get together and campaign and propose ways of getting the vote. Um, the um, these often kind of had a reputation for becoming unruly, that women would often kind of resort to riots and that. But it's a bit different from what happened in England, for instance, where women actually resorted to terrorism. But here it was basically the police would show up, somebody would throw something at the police, and it would turn into a brawl. But what's particularly stark about this is that it's women. And at this point, women were supposed to be, were regarded as being subservient and belonged in the domestic sphere. Of course, they clearly didn't want to be, um, but that was where they were supposed to be, and so that's why these kinds of brawls were um, broke out. um, because of one such thing, kind of the person who emerged as the leader of this movement, Susan B. Anthony, was arrested in 1872 for inciting a riot and everything. And this actually ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court actually, in US v. Anthony, um, ordered her to pay just $100 as kind of like a look. You incited a riot, so we're going to say that, but we recognize that it wasn't that serious. And Anthony um completely opposed this, saying, "I shall never pay $1 of your unjust penalty." And she never did, even though she would end up spending time in jail for it. Um, but as the movement continued throughout the 19th century, they started merging with the temperance movement, um, as kind of as a joint thing, because the temperance movement was often led by women, and often in opposition to their husbands' drunkenness. Um, so, the abuse of the patriarchy was linked with intemperance and the inability to allow women to vote. But the West really led the charge, and by 1916, 13 Western states had actually passed women's suffrage. So states have the right to regulate their own voting laws. That's why in the last election, you guys might remember how a bunch of states were kind of arguing over each other's laws. Well, it's their right to regulate their own voting laws, and so a bunch of Western states were passing this. Um, but by the time of Woodrow Wilson's presidency, Democrats were very firmly against women's suffrage. It was, remember, the Democrats at this point were the conservative party, and so to conserve patriarchy, um, allowing women to vote would threaten that. Um, and so the Wilson actually campaigned in 1912 against women's suffrage. He did so again in 1916. So throughout his presidency, he was very much against women's suffrage. And you can see here that World War I really brought this to a head. Kaiser Wilson is what that says. Kaiser, as in the German emperor. Um, the Kaiser, being compared with the Kaiser, our declared enemy, was not a good look. And so, you have forgotten your sympathy with the poor Germans because they were not self-governed. Well, 20 million American women are not self-governed. So he would often talk about the need for self-determination, self-government, and that. And this lady is very much very much stabbing him with his own knife. Um, and throughout World War One, there was also the fact that a bunch of men going off to war meant that there were a bunch of manufacturing jobs that needed to be filled, and so women ended up working in factories and that to fill those jobs. There were already plenty of women working in factories, anyways. Um, and so this kind of brought solidarity to the movement as well. And remember, they're also in conjunction with the temperance movement. Another thing that um, came in vogue during World War One was the need to use grain specifically for the war effort. So using grain towards whiskey, or using um, or using grapes towards anything other than grape juice for the troops, um, rather than making wine and all that. That was a problem, and so temperance started inching towards prohibition during World War One, and um, with all of this, women started having women's days. This was actually started by the Soviet Union, um, with the first Women's Day happening in on January 1st of their calendar, which was like February 1st or something like that. Um, and they hadn't switched over to the Gregorian calendar until mid 1918. Um, and so women were there was already a movement to have national celebrations of Women's Day starting in 1914, actually. Um, but the U.S. did not officially support it until 1919. And as part of this Women's Day things, Woodrow Wilson happened to be passing by a bunch of women protesting very much like this, um, in 1919, um, and he saw a bunch of women saying this stuff about him, and he had like a change of heart. One of the few times that he had a change of heart. Of course, what might have helped this is that later on that year he actually had a stroke that pretty much made him an invalid, and his wife um, kind of passed notes between him and his cabinet, and this has led to rampant speculation of possibly her actually just writing the notes and not and basically being president. Um, and so obviously these kinds of things led to significant support from the Wilson administration for women's suffrage. And that was the key turning point in what led to the 19th Amendment. It also was the key turning point in the 18th Amendment, which was passed earlier that year. The 18th Amendment was prohibition, the 19th Amendment was women's suffrage. See how these two movements were interlinked. And so women's suffrage was passed in 1919 and ratified fairly quickly, going into force by the next election in 1920. So the first time all the women in the U.S. could vote, save for those disenfranchised in the Jim Crow South, was in 1920. So you could see this whole thing built up during the Wilson administration. But Wilson also had a significant change in terms of foreign policy, not just in terms of World War One, but in terms of the entire world, especially when it came to non-white countries. Wilson basically founded what is known in foreign policy circles as Wilsonianism. Kind of an obvious name if you couldn't tell, but Wilsonianism is basically ideological interventionism. The idea that that the U.S. should intervene on behalf of ideology. Um, Up until this point, interventions were basically always on behalf of imperialism, protecting U.S. nationals, and all that kind of stuff. Now it was about helping self-determination. You could tell there's a bit of disingenuity when it comes to Wilson's idea of self-determination, because he didn't, when it came to white countries, he didn't want to intervene in their affairs. If they're white, then then they can't, they've already self-determined, so can't intervene. Although we did see in the Small Wars lecture his contrary to that sentiment, he did invade Russia. But especially with the Mexican border war, which we talked in the previous lecture, he became very anti-Huerta, the person who came to power during the Mexican Revolution in late 1913 and early 1914. Hence why he intervened in Veracruz. You might remember that, and also after Pancho Villa attacked New Mexico. This basically turned the U.S. into what we might call world police, and you could see even in 1916, this is already the portrayal that people are starting to depict the U.S. as. This was in a New York newspaper, and eventually ran in Puck, I believe. He also intervened in Haiti during his presidency, taking over Haiti for the next all the way until 1934. The U.S. remained occupying Haiti. He did the same thing with the Dominican Republic, though we got out of there in the 1920s. These were over debts, and that it was basically to help prop up the local governments there. So Haiti and the Dominican Republic are actually on the same island. So at one point, the U.S. controlled both halves of that island, and basically controlled all the tax revenue and from their tariffs, as in occupying the customs houses there. And this was done in the name of self-determination, something that you can tell is kind of a running theme. You can't self-determine until Wilson has self-determined for you. But since World War I was fight between white nations, the U.S. intervening was seen as uncouth, not something that we should do. And Wilson would actually run in 1916 with the campaign slogan, he kept us out of the war. But the year prior to that, the Germans sank the British ship, the RMS Lusitania, and Wilson chose not to intervene then, even though more than 100 Americans died in that sinking. Although the Lusitania was actually ferrying arms, so it wasn't exactly a peaceful cruiser. But in response to the Lusitania, Wilson secretly released the Federal Reserve to allow banks to start loaning to foreign powers. And can you guess which side of that conflict banks started loaning to? So the U.S. was never really neutral. The idea of U.S. neutrality during World War I is kind of silly. The Wilson was basically always pro-British, and you might remember from his dissertation, he was kind of always pro-British even before becoming president. Um, but the Germans reacted to this by escalating espionage to the point of using bomb attacks to disable U.S. weapons manufacturing. In fact, one of these bombings, though at the time people thought that it was actually just a natural explosion from, well, not natural, but an accidental explosion from a dockyard in New York Harbor. It turns out that it was actually a German planted bomb, and that ended up damaging the Statue of Liberty. So quite a symbolic gesture there is damaging the Statue of Liberty. So with all of this, into 1916, the both the Republicans and Democrats, being led by Wilson, actually opposed entry into World War I, even though Teddy Roosevelt had actually proposed creating a new Rough Riders to join in World War I. He ultimately did not allow Roosevelt to do that. Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge, the leading light of the Republicans in Congress, had actually proposed a so-called League to Enforce Peace, essentially a League of Nations that was solely focused on maintaining treaties of peace. And Wilson would refuse this and then act like he created the League of Nations that would follow, even though he was just following Henry Cabot Lodge's idea and actually making it worse. But that will be for next time, when we talk about the U.S. entry into World War I and its aftermath. So, with all of that being said, let's talk a little bit about the legacy of Woodrow Wilson and how he still remains an integral part of understanding why the U.S. is like it is today. So first of all, there was the cultural adoption of the Lost Cause. That in 1915, the Birth of a Nation took the U.S. by storm. You might remember that Wilson was directly quoted in that movie, and that the KKK arose because of it. And the Lost Cause would actually become quite a cultural staple, to the point that it was taught in northern schools well into the 1970s and 80s. Luckily, the Lost Cause is steadily abating, but you will still find pockets of it everywhere, especially on the internet today. And as part of this, Jim Crow came to the federal government. So the federal government became segregated because of Woodrow Wilson, and that will have lasting effects well into the present. We will talk about how the New Deal was infected by Jim Crow. But this also was basically the end of progressivism. You'll remember that the progressives generally wanted a lot more reform than merely the Fed and FTC. And the creation of the IRS was, a Taft legacy more than a Wilson legacy. It's just Wilson happened to take the presidency after the ratification of the 16th Amendment. But also, this started a steady removal of tariffs, though subsequent Republicans would raise the tariff during the 1920s. But this is kind of what initiated the party switch, the great party switch of the 20th century, where the mantle of liberalism was passed from Republicans to Democrats, especially after FDR started doing the New Deal, and LBJ much later in the 1960s signed the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, both of which really turned the South against the Democratic Party. Just in time for for Republicans to start shifting rightward to oppose these things, and eventually the Republican Party would become kind of the opposition party and the party of conservatism, though it would take half a century to do that. Another legacy of the Wilson administration was Wilsonianism, this idea of fighting for democracy, self-determination, all that kind of stuff. Anytime you hear we'll talk about going to Iraq and fighting for democracy and all that kind of stuff. If you guys remember that far back, you'll remember that there was even a very popular song called freedom isn't free, and that people were saying that we had to fight Iraq to fight for democracy in that. Well, this is a slogan from Wilson. It's that idea of ideological intervention. And so the US's propensity for these long-term interventions, while having its precedents prior to Wilson, is really geared up by Wilson's whole idea of ideology driving US policy rather than self-interest. The opposition in if you talk to if you're ever talking to foreign policy experts, there's kind of two modes of thought in terms of foreign policy. There's Wilsonianism, as in it should be directed towards having more self-determination throughout the entire world and all that kind of stuff. And then there are realists who view nations as individual units that should not be interfered with, that the US policy should be purely about self-interest. And so that's kind of the dual thing. We'll see that Wilsonianism really wins out. Wilsonianism is kind of the key thing pushing the US to oppose things like fascism and communism throughout the 20th century. And as opposed to being opposed to these things simply because they're against the US's national interests. Instead, it's about that they are ideologically opposed. And so that's what Wilsonianism is. And you'll find most politicians today are Wilsonian in their view of foreign policy. Throughout World War I, we'll see later on that not only because of World War I, but with the FTC and the Federal Reserve and the IRS, the U.S. federal government explodes in power, and the presidency itself starts a very general trend towards centralizing power around the presidency. We'll see in the World War I lecture that it gets way crazier. That in fact, the Fed and FTC seem like small things compared to things like the Espionage and Sedition Acts. But that's for next week. And finally, Wilson's push for the Treaty of Versailles ultimately fails in the US. And so the League of Nations that I've briefly mentioned don't happen. Yet again, that's another thing for next week. We don't have time to go over all of what happens during World War I. But that's kind of the legacy of Woodrow Wilson. So hold on a second while I stop the screen share. So my question for you guys today is, what do you think is the most important part of that legacy? What do you think affects you today? What of Woodrow Wilson's presidency do you see affecting you today?
I mean, I'd say personally that's the interventionism he left behind. That's our current mostly foreign policy when it comes to warfare. I mean, the last 10, 20 more like years we've spent in foreign intervention in some way or the other,
Mhm.
mostly with anti-terrorist groups. But that's something that you see today and is ahead in right in front of you today.
Hmm. Yeah, because we're still fighting what's called the global war on terror, right? The We will actually have that will be the final lecture in this course is on the what folks in the military call the GWAT, but um the uh the global war on terror has, while it's very much about you know uh fighting terrorism, obviously, um some people view it with a little bit more a little bit harsher as talking about oil or um US control in the Middle East or spheres of influence in that. There's a lot of open questions as to what the global war on terror is ultimately about. um
Well,
and
sorry.
and so this interventionism is absolutely a part of it because the US's willingness to declare some nation a terrorist sympathizer or a terrorist supporter or something along those lines, um, and thereby condemning it to either sanctions or intervention and occupation. That's very much a legacy of Wilson. So yeah, that is definitely something. Margaret says, my grandpa will argue that the Civil War was over states' rights and had almost nothing to do with slavery, which is very much the lost cause, which feels like it takes away the importance of the war and our involvement in slavery and white supremacy. Um, yeah, that the legacy, the important, the general belief in the lost cause is very much a legacy of Wilson's administration. One could argue that it was a legacy of Wilson's power prior to his administration, but it amplified during his administration, especially with the birth of a nation and creation of the KKK. Um, the second Klan, I should say, the first Klan was eliminated in 1872, but um, the current Klan has no relation with the first Klan, but it does have relations with the second Klan. We currently call it either the fourth or fifth Klan, depending on how you divide the clans. Um, the second Klan kind of disappeared in the 1930s. The third Klan kind of arose from its ashes during the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, and the third Klan kind of reformulated itself during the late 70s and early 80s. Um, and there's a question as to whether or not the current Klan should be divided from the fourth Klan because of the internet and how it's organized today. Um, Especially with the fact that like actual Klan membership doesn't matter so much as like um pro white supremacy things that you guys might remember, like Gamergate that happened on YouTube a while ago, that really fed into this whole idea of anti SJWs and all that, and a lot of that is often called the fifth Klan. But you know uh, it's a big debate on that, but ultimately all of that is fed by the lost cause, which leads right back to Wilson. um what else can you guys see of Wilson's legacy today? Anybody?
I was gonna say the women's rights and
So, I mean, you could say definitely that you're talking about like the passage of the 19th Amendment.
exactly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it happened. He supported it kind of last minute, and his support certainly uh, changed the needle, but it does kind of forget the fact that he openly opposed it during both of his campaigns.
Yeah, it's definitely messed up, but at least it was a beginning or the start for the legalization of, or not legalization, but the
Women's suffrage.
exactly.
Yeah, I mean, women have had the vote ever since. It's a um, constitutional right. There, in 1921, that was the first time that the what would be the following document to try to give civil rights to women, known as the Equal Rights Amendment, and we will see in much later lectures that that doesn't really go anywhere. The Equal Rights Amendment still hasn't been passed even today. There was a brief stint in the 1970s that it almost got ratified, but it didn't get ratified. Um, the uh, the But there's still talk about having an equal rights amendment, especially adding stuff to it. For instance, sexual orientation as one such thing. For maybe even gender equality, as in allowing for trans identity rather than legislators who are openly trying to legislate cis identity. Um, and so some of that is still coming about, but there's kind of an open question as to whether or not that's directly connected to what's known as first wave feminism. First wave feminism are the suffragettes, the people who fought for suffrage. Even though the ERA comes from that generation, we'll see next week that the suffrage movement just kind of fell apart during the 1920s. So, you know, it's once they achieved their goal, it's kind of the same thing happened in the civil rights movement, right? In the 1960s, once they had achieved the civil rights bill and the Voting Rights Act, it also falls apart into factionalism and that. But I don't know how much of that could be Wilson's legacy, though. How do you see Wilson as part of that? Or do you see Wilson as part of that?
That's what I was about to say. Is now I'm kind of questioning if I do.
Yeah, I would say throwing his support behind a movement at the last possible minute isn't much of a legacy, right? It's something that
definitely.
had to basically be fought over, and can't forget how he segregated the federal government. This is something that he took active part in, as opposed to suffrage. So
Yeah.
I would argue that, but you could easily argue the other way. That's one of the things about history, is that a lot of it is about interpretation. And so that's part of why I wanted to ask that legacy question. We have ran out of time, so we can't really go too deep into the various arguments. But when we're talking about legacy, that's another way of phrasing historical significance, which, once again, that's part of the test. If you were to see the Wilson administration as this, you could say that it's any number of these things as the significance of it. Now, I would hope that you would be a little bit more comprehensive in your answer, but I hope you guys have a vague idea of how legacy can be a form of historical significance. With that being said, are there any questions before we go?
The quiz is available right now? Yeah.
Yes, the quiz is available and it will be up until Friday night. So be sure to go take that quiz and don't forget about it. It's not worth very much of your grade, but it will at least give you an idea of how well you're comprehending the class.
Sweet.
So, any other questions? All right. Well, have a good day, everyone.
You too.